Washington just shocked the world. America is slapping 50% tariffs on India starting August 27th, and this could spark the biggest U.S.-India economic clash in decades. Reports from Reuters and the Times of India confirm that these new tariffs target everything from metals to electronics, with an extra 25% hike hitting India's exporters the hardest. In Tamil Nadu, one of India's biggest export hubs, nearly 3 million jobs are suddenly at risk. Factories fear shutdowns, workers are preparing street protests, and India's government is weighing retaliation. But America isn't escaping either. Inside U.S. homes, prices of groceries, cars, and household metals are already climbing. Families are asking, is this tariff war worth the cost? For decades, Washington and New Delhi called each other partners. But now this clash threatens to undo years of trust, just as China is watching closely from the sidelines. The question is, will this tariff showdown end in a deal or drag America and India into a full-scale trade war that shakes the global economy?
Why is Trump increasing tariffs on India? The U.S. says India and China are helping Russia in the Ukraine war. But let's look at the numbers. China buys 47% of Russia's crude, India 38%, but the EU still buys 6%. When it comes to liquefied natural gas, the EU is the biggest buyer at 51%, followed by China and Japan. For pipeline gas, again the EU leads with 37%, then China and Turkey. And the US, it still imports Russian uranium, palladium, fertilizers, and chemicals. So if India is doing less trade with Russia than the EU, why is the US increasing tariffs on India? The United States is doing less trade with Russia than the EU. Why is the US increasing tariffs on India? The United States is making deals with every major country, using tariffs as a tool. It also wants a trade agreement with India, but that deal hasn't been finalized. Not on US terms, at least. The US wants access to India's agriculture and dairy markets, but India opposes this to protect its local farmers. So now, the US is using tariffs to pressure India into opening its markets. What do you think about this? Tell us in the comments.
India has been jolted to look for new trading partners as US tariffs of 50% have taken effect.
US President Donald Trump has sent a second message to Prime Minister Modi full of endearments.
While the rest of the country was still struggling with the price of gasoline and milk, our president decided to show the world American power. With a single stroke of his pen, he raised tariffs on goods from India by 50%, a move that politicians called strategic but ordinary people like us saw as a gamble. The reason to teach India a lesson for buying cheap Russian oil. A great idea, sure, but no one seemed to think about a simple question. When you raise the prices of goods from a country that supplies us with medicines, carpets, and hundreds of other things, who pays? Either way, it looks like a trade war has just begun, and we, the people of Ohio, Chicago, and across America, will be the first to fight. On August 28, 2025, U.S. President Donald Trump escalated tensions in an already fractured global economy by signing an executive order that raised tariffs on Indian imports from 25% to a staggering 50%.
Then definitely there will be a change on 50%.
This policy, one of the most aggressive trade measures against a major partner, was framed as a direct response to India's continued purchase of discounted Russian oil amid the ongoing Russia-Ukraine war, now in its third year. The White House argued that targeting key buyers like India would choke Russia's war funding, forcing an end to the conflict in Ukraine. Yet this move was not merely about geopolitics. It unleashed a chain reaction of economic consequences, amplifying inflation and straining trade networks worldwide. For the average American, the impact was immediate and personal. Consider a family in Ohio already stretched thin by rising costs, now facing higher prices for Indian-made clothing and generic medicines. These tariffs, rooted in the distant war in Ukraine, brought the harsh realities of sanctions home, intertwining global conflict with everyday struggles. The policy also exposed deeper tensions. America's attempt to assert dominance clashed with India's need to secure affordable energy for its 1.4 billion citizens, setting the stage for a broader economic showdown. As war-driven sanctions collided with inflationary pressures, the world watched a high-stakes gamble unfold.
Lovely day, fans. Today, United States has just entered a dangerous new chapter in global trade. President Trump has stunned the world by doubling tariff on Indian goods to a staggering 50%, igniting what many now call an economic war with one of the American closest allies. But this isn't just politics. This decision is already reshaping price in your home, your medicine cabinet, and even the food on your table. Grab your coffee. I'll be back for more documentary.
From today, many Indian-made goods landing in the United States will be slapped with an extra 25% tariff. The US.
In a shocking turn of events, the President of the United States announced he is raising tariffs on a nation that is also a longtime ally. President Trump declared that import taxes on goods from India will double to 50%, and he justified this drastic move by pointing to India's continued purchase of oil from Russia despite Western sanctions on Moscow. In his reasoning, India is one of the largest buyers of Russian oil, second only to China, and he insisted America must respond to what he views as India undermining U.S. foreign policy. This abrupt trade salvo has upended the relationship with New Delhi and sent policymakers worldwide scrambling to assess the fallout. Prime Minister Narendra Modi, facing Trump's trade blitz, has already vowed that India will not compromise under pressure, setting the stage for a high-stakes showdown. Trade confrontation has spiraled into a nightmare scenario now playing out for millions of Americans. In just 30 days since the tariff announcement, the United States has seen about $87 billion in trade partnerships evaporate as India hit back. Critical drug supply chains began to crumble, meaning families suddenly had to pay 20 to 40% more for life-saving medications. This decision from Washington triggered one of the most devastating economic backlashes in modern trade history. It is no ordinary trade spat. It has morphed into a full-blown economic war, and everyday people are caught in the crossfire. Households nationwide are already feeling the shock. Products that once were affordable have suddenly become expensive, and even basic goods are growing scarce week by week. A single stroke of his pen by President Trump has set in motion a trade backlash unlike any in recent memory. Ironically, America actually sells more to India than it buys when services are included, meaning this tariff war is undermining one of America's most lucrative trade relationships. Now families across the nation are already paying the price. Analysts estimate the average U.S. household will pay about $1,300 more due to this clash, and the U.S. economy could shrink by up to 8%. India has responded with a systematic economic counterattack that is already reshaping global commerce. The world's largest democracy isn't blinking. In fact, what India does next could upend everything we thought we knew about international trade. We will reveal the full scope of that response later in this video. On August 6, 2025, President Trump stunned observers by making what many now call the most catastrophic trade decision of his presidency. He announced that tariffs on Indian goods would double from an already steep 25% to a staggering 50%, targeting what he described as India's unfair trade practices. This wasn't just a routine trade dispute. It was effectively an economic declaration of war against a nation of 1.4 billion people that happens to be America's fourth largest trading partner. India ships nearly $87 billion in goods to the United States each year, a flow of commerce that Trump was willing to put on the line with a stroke of a pen. The dramatic announcement sent shockwaves through markets and left companies in both countries bracing for a punishing fallout. However, this drastic move did not come out of the blue. Tensions between Washington and New Delhi had been building for months over a series of strategic choices by India that the U.S. viewed with growing alarm. India was aligning itself with the BRICS bloc, an alliance of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa that together accounts for over 40% of the world's population, and endorsing the group's push for a new gold-backed currency that could challenge the US dollar's dominance. On top of that, India kept buying cheap oil from Russia, even as the West sanctioned Moscow for its invasion of Ukraine. To President Trump, these moves were seen as a direct threat to American influence, and he was determined to hit back hard. All these actions, undermining the dollar's primacy and defying US pressure, set the stage for a high-stakes confrontation. In fact, Trump's tariff offensive against India began even before the August 6th shocker. On August 1st, his administration quietly rolled out a blanket 25% tariff on all imports from India, invoking national security as the rationale. Unusually, this initial volley offered no exceptions, not even for crucial items like generic pharmaceuticals and electronic components that American consumers and companies rely on. It was a signal that Washington was willing to endure some self-inflicted pain to make a geopolitical point. That move on August 1st was essentially a warning shot. But when India refused to bend to U.S. demands, Trump doubled down with a far more drastic 50% tariff bombshell just days later. In Trump's eyes, India's most egregious offense was its oil trade with Russia. Following Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022, India saw an opportunity and massively increased its imports of discounted Russian crude. Before the war, Russian oil made up virtually none of India's imports. By the middle of 2025, more than a third of the oil flowing into India was coming from Russia. This provided India with cheap energy and undercut the Western sanctions aimed at Moscow. While some European countries quietly continued buying Russian fuel through back channels, Trump zeroed in on India's open dealings with Moscow as a major affront. The White House echoed his outrage, arguing that every barrel of Russian oil India bought was essentially money flowing to Vladimir Putin's war machine, and that New Delhi's actions were undermining international efforts to isolate Russia. From Trump's perspective, India's energy choices had crossed a red line, becoming a direct challenge to U.S. foreign policy. New Delhi's reply to these accusations was firm and pragmatic. Indian officials pointed out that their Russian oil purchases were actually helping stabilize global energy prices by easing demand on other suppliers. By buying from Moscow, India reduced competition from Middle Eastern oil, the very same oil that Europe and America depend on, thus preventing worse price spikes worldwide. They also noted the apparent double standards. Many of the Western nations lecturing India were still buying Russian energy in roundabout ways themselves. India's External Affairs Ministry emphasized that securing affordable, reliable energy for India's 1.4 billion citizens is a fundamental duty of the government. Citing its policy of strategic autonomy, India insisted it would make decisions based on its own national interest, meaning it wasn't about to cut off a cheap oil supply that kept the lights on and fuel prices manageable at home. By early August, neither side was willing to back down. Diplomatic talks to defuse the situation went nowhere. That's when President Trump decided to detonate his economic doomsday device. The full 50% tariff. The moment he did, decades of goodwill in U.S.-India relations went out the window. The financial markets shuddered, and pundits across the political spectrum gasped at the sheer scale of the move. It was an unprecedented salvo against a friendly nation. Economists warned that India would feel compelled to retaliate forcefully, and they were absolutely right. What few expected was the innovative and punishing manner in which India would exact its revenge. India's counterstrike was unlike the simple tit-for-tat tariffs of past trade spats. Instead, it was a masterclass in economic strategy, swift, targeted, and unrelenting. Rather than slap a mirror image tariff on American goods, New Delhi unleashed what experts described as asymmetric economic warfare. It pinpointed the most vulnerable pressure points in the American economy and struck at them with surgical precision. The objective was clear: inflict maximal pain on key U.S. industries and interests, while minimizing collateral damage to India's own economy. In the coming days, a series of Indian moves would catch Washington off guard and drive home just how costly this trade war would be for the United States. The first blow landed on America's medicine cabinet. The United States buys about $10.5 billion worth of pharmaceutical products from India each year, roughly a third of India's total pharma exports. These medicines aren't luxury goods. They are critical generic drugs and components, antibiotics, heart medications, insulin, and more, that millions of Americans rely on daily to stay healthy. In a calculated response, India imposed export restrictions on several key drug ingredients and generic medicines destined for the U.S. overnight. This created shortages for U.S. pharmaceutical suppliers and drove up drug prices. Within weeks, the cost of common medications in American pharmacies had surged by around 35%. A family that used to spend $200 a month on prescription drugs was suddenly paying closer to $280 for the same pills. U.S. officials scrambled to find alternative sources in Europe and elsewhere, but it was too late. The supply shock was already rippling through hospitals and households. American families were now literally paying the price of the trade war every time they visited the pharmacy. Next, India opened a new front in the tech sector, exploiting America's dependence on Indian talent and services. India has one of the world's largest IT workforces, and major U.S. tech companies heavily rely on Indian engineers and offshore teams for their operations. In retaliation, Indian IT firms and service providers began hiking the rates they charge U.S. clients. Simultaneously, they offered discounted deals to companies in Europe and Asia to lure business away from American firms. The message to Silicon Valley was clear. If Washington was going to treat India as an economic enemy, then India's tech industry would rearrange its priorities accordingly. The consequences were immediate. Suddenly, U.S. tech giants found themselves paying more for the same work. Projects got costlier, profit margins tightened, and inevitably those higher costs started filtering down to American consumers through more expensive software, electronics, and online services. Then came the squeeze on American farmers. India is a huge buyer of U.S. agricultural exports, from Midwestern soybeans to Great Plains wheat and corn. But faced with Trump's tariffs, Indian importers swiftly pivoted away from American produce. Large orders for U.S. grain and oilseeds were canceled or left unrenewed. Instead, India increased purchases from other agricultural powerhouses like Brazil, Argentina, and Australia. The effect on American agriculture was devastating. Take corn as an example. Farmers who used to ship millions of bushels to India each year watched that market evaporate virtually overnight, erasing roughly $2 billion in annual export revenue. Soybean growers, already reeling from other trade disputes, saw one of their fastest-growing markets vanish. In farming communities across states like Iowa, Illinois, and Kansas, the pain was palpable. Grain prices fell due to the glut, farm incomes dropped, and the shockwaves hit local economies. Equipment dealers, grain elevators, trucking companies, and small-town businesses all felt the strain as India's orders dried up. India's most quietly disruptive retaliation targeted the financial underpinnings of global trade. Being part of BRICS, India had been laying groundwork for financial systems outside U.S. control. And now it accelerated that effort dramatically. Indian banks and corporations began conducting more and more trade in currencies other than the dollar, settling payments in Indian rupees, Chinese yuan, or UAE dirhams, and embracing new international payment networks that bypass the US-dominated SWIFT system. In some cases, Indian importers and exporters even turned to cryptocurrency platforms to move money without touching traditional banking channels. For American financial institutions, this was a nightmare scenario. Big Wall Street banks like JP Morgan Chase and Citibank, which normally earn hefty fees acting as intermediaries in international transactions, suddenly saw a chunk of the US-India trade flow slipping out of their grasp. As deals got routed outside the dollar ecosystem, those banks lost out on transaction fees and foreign exchange profits. The shift was subtle at first, but its implications were profound. India was chipping away at one of the pillars of American global economic influence, the primacy of the dollar and the reach of US banks. As the trade war deepened, economists began tallying up the damage to the US economy. The projections were grim. The Penn-Wharton budget model estimated that Trump's steep tariffs, combined with the fallout from India's retaliation, would eventually shrink US gross domestic product by around 8% and drive average American wages down by roughly 7%. Put in personal terms, a middle-income American family might lose on the order of $58,000 in lifetime earnings as a result of slower growth. Another analysis by the Tax Foundation found that these tariffs amount to a tax increase on U.S. consumers, costing the average household about $1,300 in 2025 alone. Unlike a direct tax on the wealthier corporations, this kind of import tax hits the middle class and working class hardest, because they spend a larger share of their income on the very goods that were suddenly made more expensive. And the pain isn't just theoretical. Early economic data started to reflect the downturn. The Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta, for example, slashed its growth forecast and predicted the U.S. economy would contract by roughly 2.7%.
August 6, 2025, a single decision from Washington has set in motion one of the most devastating trade backlash in modern history. What started as a penalty on India by buying Russia oil has spiraled into a full-blown economic war. A war not fought with tanks and missiles, but with tariff, supply chain, and currency. India's counter-strike has been swift and precise, restricting life-saving medicine and cutting off American farmers, squeezing Silicon Valley and accelerating a global shift away from US dollars. For the first time in decades, Washington is facing not just resistance, but a coordinated pushback from one of the world's largest democracies. And make no mistake, the victim hasn't faceless corporations. They are ordinary Americans. Families now pay more for medicine. Farmers lose billion-dollar market. Households are set to shoulder an extra $1,300 in cost this year alone. Analysts warn that American economy can shrink by nearly 8%, wiping out tens of thousands of dollars in lifetime earnings for average family. The lesson: in an interconnected world, economic warfare boomerang, a policy meant to punish India has ended up punishing America itself and shifting balance of global power in the process. What India does next could define the future of international trade, the domicile of the US dollars, and America's place in the world. This trade war isn't just headline, it's history being written in real time, and the price of the history is already showing up in wallet of everyone. This is Find the Dot. Stay tuned, stay aware, and always connect the dot. Special credit to the Stitches clip and the footage that helped bring this story to light.